Guten Tag, y'all. This is Zakhev here, and the reason why we're doing this video today is because I figured it's the last day of the World War II Chronicles. I didn't really take part in the World War II Chronicles, do all the events, to get the Iron Duke or the KV-2 Model 1940, but I saw this today, because it's May 8th, it is VE Day when I'm recording this. It's probably going to go up on May 9th or 10th. And it was the Battle of Berlin, the defense of the Reichstag, and I will be doing just that with a group of Tiger II-H's and Tiger II-P's against the Bolshevik invaders on the other team. And I figured today we'll talk about, just go over the Battle of Berlin and the events that actually took place in it, because I feel like it's not the most historically documented battle of the war, because everyone's just at least in American schools, it's they talk about it and they're like, oh, the Russians came in, they destroyed everything, they raised the flag, took the famous picture, and the Nazis were defeated. It wasn't that simple, guys. This was the last ditch resistance for the Wehrmacht and the Third Reich as a whole, and for the little amount of logistics and resources they had, they did put up quite a good fight, considering that they were going against a substantial force of over 1.5 million Soviet soldiers. Well, the Battle of Berlin started really with the Oder-Neisse, and that was the sector with the most fighting overall, because in that sector was Seelow Heights. The last major defensive line outside of Berlin was Seelow Heights. It was over 4 days of fighting, from April 16th to April 19th, 1945, and close to 1 million Soviet soldiers with more than 20,000 tanks and artillery pieces were put into action in that sector to break through to the gates of Berlin, because the Germans fortified all of it. It was they fortified that entire position so they could rain down on the Soviets approaching below. And they had the strength of 100,000 German soldiers with 1,200 tanks and guns. On the final day, April 19th, the 1st Belarusian Front broke through the final line at Seelow Heights, and nothing but broken German formations laid between them and Berlin. Marshal Ivan Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front, having captured Forst the day before, was fanning out into the open country, where there was not a lot of defenses and it was just easy to plow through, so basically farm fields and stuff. And they were heading northwest towards Berlin instead, while other armies headed west towards a section of the U.S. Army front line south, which is where the famous meeting on the Elbe was between Soviets and Americans. And by the end of the 19th of April, the German Eastern Front line of Frankfurt and Seelow, and to the south, around Forst, had ceased to exist completely. Both those breakthroughs allowed two Soviet fronts to envelop or encircle the German Ninth Army in a large pocket known as the Frankfurt Pocket. And the Ninth Army did attempt to break out to the west, which would result in the Battle of Halb. The cost to the Soviets had been very high between the 1st and 19th of April, with over 2,807 tanks lost. I mean, yeah, they produced their tanks in large quantities, and they mass-produced T-34s and everything, but this wasn't just T-34s, this was IS-2s, this was everything, anything, really. And despite a tank being lost, that's still losing a tank. That took time and effort to put together. And out of that 2,807, they lost 727 at Seelow Heights alone. So the Seelow Heights offensive was very costly for the Soviet forces that were advancing. Regardless of how many they had, it's still quite a bit. That's I can't do the math in my head right now. But over almost 3,000 out of 20,000 tanks and artillery pieces. That's quite a bit. That's a good chunk for an army that's on the brink of collapse. On April 20th, though, 420 blazing, happy birthday Adolf. No, just kidding. It was a terrible day. Don't say happy birthday Adolf. Soviet artillery of the 79 Rifle Corps. Wow, Rifle Corps. Wow, I'm sorry, Rifle Corps of the First Belarusian Front started shelling Berlin. Thereafter, Soviet artillery continued their bombardment on Berlin and didn't stop until the city surrendered in total. That's where you see like those famous film reels of the German prisoners being marched to the Russian lines and the Katyusha rockets firing off in the distance. And after the battle was ended, the Soviets actually pointed out the weight of explosives delivered by the Red Army during the battle was greater than the tonnage dropped by the Western Allied bombers on the city, which is debated. The First Belarusian Front advanced towards the east and northeast of the city, though, while as the First Ukrainian Front had pushed through the last formations of the northern wing of General Ferdinand Schorner's Army Group Center, and they passed north of Uderbog. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. While over halfway to the American front line on the Elbe at Magdeburg. To the north between Stettin and Schwedt, Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front attacked the northern flank of General Gotthard Henrichi's Army Group Vistula, held by Hassel von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army. So that's where the Panzer for 3rd Panzer Army was located. By the 24th of April, elements of the 1st Belarusian Front and the 1st Ukrainian Front had completely encircled the city, cutting off like any outside escape. That it was just, you were trapped if you were not out by them. On the 25th of April, the 2nd Belarusian Front broke through the 3rd Panzer Army's line around the bridgehead south of Stettin and crossed the Rondo Swamp. They were now free to move west towards the British 21st Army Group and north towards the Baltic port of Stralsund. The Soviet 58th Guards Division and Zadov's 5th Guard Army made contact with the U.S. 69th Infantry Division of the 1st Army near Torgau on the River Elbe. The Soviet investment of Berlin consolidated with leading units probing and penetrating the S-Bahn defensive ring. By the end of the 25th of April, there was no prospect that the German defense of the city could do anything but temporarily delay the capture of the capital by the Soviets, as the decisive stages of the battle had already been fought, and basically the German army had collapsed at this point. Any fighting at this point was by fanatics who believed in the idea of the Nazi Party and believed in National Socialism and the cause that Hitler went to war for, and those were the people who were fighting the hardest at this point, if any were fighting still at all and not trying to get out. On the 20th of April, Hitler had ordered Clausewitz, which was the evacuation of all Wehrmacht and SS officers in Berlin, which formalized its status as a frontline city. Thus, only combatant personnel were to be in the city. The forces available to Artillery General Helmuth Wilding for the city's defense included several severely depleted Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS divisions. In all, they totaled out to about 45,000 men, as opposed to the Soviets' nearly 2 million men. These formations were supplemented by the police force, boys in compulsory Hitler Youth, and the Volkssturm, which was the Home Guard. Hitler had appointed SS Brigadeführer Wilhelm Monk, commander of the city's central government district, as well, and Monk's command post was under the high command area of the Reich Chancellery. The core group of his fighting were the 800 members of the Leibstrandat, and he had a total of over 2,000 men under his command as well. And that entire strength of those men, their purpose was to guard the Führer. That was their main objective. They could not let the Soviets get to the Reich Chancellery and breach the Führer bunker and capture Hitler. Meanwhile, Wilding organized the defenses into 8 sectors designated from A to H, and each was commanded by a colonel or a general, which, even though they held such ranks, they didn't have combat experience for the most part. The 20th Infantry Division was to the west of the city, while as the 9th Fallschirmjäger Division was to the north. The Panzer Division Munchenberg was to the northeast, and the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland to the southeast. And to the east of Tempelhof Airport, the reserve 18th Panzergrenadier Division was in Berlin's central district as well. Now, as far as the actual infantry combat goes for the Battle of Berlin, the basic Soviet combat group was a mixed arms unit of about 8 men in assault groups of 6 to 8 soldiers, closely supported by field artillery. You see a lot of film reels of them moving around field guns and stuff like that. These were tactical units which were able to apply the tactics of house-to-house fighting, such as that in Stalingrad, that they had been forced to develop and refine at each fortress city that they encountered. While as the German tactics for urban warfare in Berlin were dictated by 3 considerations: the experience that they had gained during 5 years of war, the physical characteristics of the city, and the methods used by the Soviets. So it was basically their own strength in combination with how they could counter Soviet offensive. However, the Germans did not use makeshift barricades erected close to street corners, because they would just get blown up by artillery firing. Instead, they put snipers and machine guns on the upper floors of roofs because Soviet tanks couldn't aim their guns that high, and simultaneously they put their men armed with Panzerfausts and cellar windows to ambush tanks as they moved down the streets, so they were basically being shot from the ground. Initially, the Soviet tanks advanced down middle of the streets, but to counter the German tactics, which they quickly had to do, they altered their own and started to hug the sides of the streets, allowing for supporting crossfire from tanks either side of the wider thoroughfares. The Soviets also had submachine gunners ride on the tanks, and they would spray down every doorway and window that seemed sketchy, but this meant the tank could not traverse its turret quickly because they knocked the guys off. Another solution was to rely on the heavy howitzers, the 152mm and the 203mm, firing over open sites to blast defended buildings and to use anti-aircraft guns against the Germans on the higher floors. Instead of directly down open streets, the Soviets also started moving through building to building so that they had cover at least when they moved. They basically just made use of the captured Panzerfaust they would find, or any explosives they really had, and they'd blow holes in the cellar walls so that it would lead into the adjoining buildings next door, and it would make like this tunnel just going through basement after basement after basement, and it would offer cover from snipers and machine gunners essentially, but more house-to-house fighting. Simultaneously, Soviets would move across the rooftops as well and just fish out and fizzle out any snipers and machine gun nests that were up there, and firing on anybody who would try to make a dash down below in the streets. Unfortunately, also because of these house-to-house fighting tactics, which included flamethrowers and grenades and just the worst weapons of infantry warfare, the civilian population hadn't been evacuated at all. So this had a lot of collateral damage in the process of this fighting. Now, the battle for the Reichstag in particular, at 6 o'clock on April 30th, the 150th Rifle Division had still not captured the upper floors of the Ministry of Interior, but while the fighting was still going on, the 150th launched an attack from there across the 400 meters of Königsplatz towards the Reichstag, which you can see here. A rough, as best they could, Gaijin tried to recreate the scene of the actual battle landscape of the Reichstag area in this map here. The assault was not an easy one, though, for the Soviets. The Germans had essentially turned the Reichstag into a fortress, and they dug a complicated network of trenches around the building, and a collapsed tunnel had filled water from the Spree, forming a moat across the Königsplatz. The initial infantry assault was decimated by crossfire from the Reichstag and the Kral Opera House on the western side of the Königsplatz. By now, the Spree had been bridged, and the Soviets were able to bring up tanks and artillery to support fresh assaults by the infantry, some of which were tasked with outflanking the Opera House and attacking it from the northwest. By 10 o'clock, the Soviet soldiers of the 150th had reached the moat, but fire from the Zoo Flak Tower prevented any further successful advance across the moat during daylight. So for the rest of the day, they sat tight, and as much as 90 artillery pieces, some as large as 203mm howitzers, just shelled the crap out of the Reichstag until they had the opportunity to move in with their infantry and begin the actual interior attack. As the Soviets closed in, though, the perimeter was shrinking, and the surviving defenders had fallen back on the city center, and thus they became concentrated. And by now, there were about 10,000 soldiers in the city center who were being assaulted just from all sides. They were completely surrounded at this point. One of the main pushes, though, by the Soviet forces was along the Wilhelmstrasse, which the Air Ministry was located, and was bombarded by Soviet artillery, heavy concentration of Soviet artillery. The remaining German Tigers of the Hermann von Salza battalion took up positions in the east of the Tiergarten to defend the center against the 3rd Shock Army. Whilst the 3rd Shock Army was also engaging the Reichstag as well as that section, the 8th Guards Tank Army was advancing through the south of the Tiergarten, and these Soviet offenses had effectively cut the sausage-shaped area held by the Germans in half and made an escape to the west for those German troops in the center much more difficult than it already was. During that next morning, though, Monk informed Hitler that the city center would not be able to hold for less than 2 days. Later that morning, Walding informed Hitler in person that the defenders would probably exhaust just all their ammunition that night, and again asked Hitler for permission to have them break out. But at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Walding, who was in the headquarters in Bendlerblock, sorry if I butchered that, finally received Hitler's permission to attempt a breakout, and at that point it was just too late. During the afternoon, though, Hitler had killed himself at this point with Eva Braun, and in accordance with Hitler's instructions, those bodies were burned outside the Reich Chancellery before the Soviets could even get to them. Because of all the smoke and dust, though, it became dark early in Berlin at the time, and at about 6 o'clock, while Wilding and his staff were finalizing their plans to escape, 3 regiments of the Soviet 150th Rifle Division, under the cover of artillery and closely supported by armor, assaulted the Reichstag, which had all of its windows bricked up, but the soldiers managed to force the main doors and enter the main hall. The German garrison of about 1,000 defenders, mixture of sailors, SS, and Hitler Youth really, fired down on the Soviets from above, turning the main hall into a medieval-style killing field, basically. So this is very close quarters stuff. Like, this is beginning of Star Wars: A New Hope, when they're all waiting there for the Empire to come in. It's like that. Suffering many casualties, though, the Soviets got beyond the main hall and started to work their way up through the building, and the fire and subsequent wartime damage had turned the building's interior into a maze of rubble and debris, amongst which the German defenders were strongly dug in. Much like the rest of the city's fighting, the fighting in the Reichstag was reduced to room, and as May Day approached, the Soviets neared the roof, but fighting was still continuing inside. Moscow claimed that the red flag was hoisted on the Reichstag at presumably 10 o'clock. However, because propaganda was so fixated on the Reichstag being captured by May 1st, it's impossible to say. I mean, there was still fighting going on when they say no matter what, like, it's undeniable that when the flag was raised, there was still fighting going on inside the Reichstag. The building was not secure. Like, they were in the basement, they were on the bottom floors. The Germans, who were in the basement too, they were well stocked with food and ammunition and launched multiple counterattacks against the Red Army, and that led to very close quarters fighting in and around the Reichstag itself. The fighting in the building and around the building ensued until the night and the coming of May 1st, until the evening when some German troops were able to pull out of the building and cross into the metro station, where they moved into the ruins hours before the main breakout across the spree with the rest of the forces. And about 300 of the last German combatants had surrendered by that point. About 200 defenders were confirmed dead, along with another 500 who were hors de combat, not able to fight. They were wounded, lying in the basement, and many were there before the main assault had even started. Shortly after the fighting in the Reichstag and around that area, the Soviet forces were able to capture Charlottenburg, and fighting kind of died down, or began to noticeably die down around May the 1st, May the 2nd. At this point, Goebbels was dead on May 1st, and Karl Dönitz, who was the appointed president of Germany after Hitler died, appointed Ludwig von Krosigk as Reichskanzler, or Chancellor, and this was all done from the Flensburg government area, the headquarters in Flensburg, known as the Flensburg government, which was the Dönitz administration for those couple of days, up before the surrender of Germany on May the 8th. At 1 in the morning, the Soviets picked up a radio message from the German 56th Corps requesting a ceasefire, and said that all emissaries would come under a white flag to Potsdamer Bridge, and General Walding and his staff surrendered at 6 a.m. the same day, and he was taken to see Lieutenant General Chukov at 8:23 a.m. The 350-strong garrison of the Zoo Flak Tower finally left the building following that, and there was sporadic fighting in isolated buildings by fanatical SS, but that was quickly stomped out by any Soviets. They blasted them away, with a total of about 180,000 prisoners. So guys, that is the Battle of Berlin. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like down below. Try to get out videos as often as I possibly can. Try to stream every now and then. My Twitch, my Facebook, my Twitter are down in the description below. Make sure to hit that like button, guys. If you want to see more, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys next time. Peace out.